And now we're lifting our gaze upward to the space, because the space economy is emerging as a surprising but powerful force in the fight against climate change. So space technologies are already changing the way we track environmental changes, use resources more wisely, and manage climate risks. A few places are better positioned to lead than in the UK. So did you know that in the UK is growing into one of the most innovative and attractive space economies in the world? With its strength in small satellite technology, agile regulation, and a history of innovation. So let's dive into how space can drive sustainability on Earth. And with that, please help me give a warm welcome to George Freeman, Donna Lindsay, and Harshbir Sangha. All right, now I want to start this conversation with Donna. She is a cartographer with deep expertise in spatial data, and you work closely with the UK Space Agency to make sure we're getting the most out of space data and innovation. So why is space so essential for achieving net zero, in a few words?
Space is essential for achieving net zero because we provide that level of objectivity and consistencies that's lacking. We've heard a lot this week around the trust and authority of data to enable those decisions to be made, and that's what space data can do.
Right, and you know, over 60% of environmental data can only be captured from space, and I'm curious, how much of that data are we not fully using?
We're using a very, very small percentage of that data. We have over 1,000 satellites up there at the moment capturing Earth observation data. That's going to triple within 10 years. So I work for Space for Climate. We are an entity that brings together academia, government, and corporations to do exactly that, to help drive the best climate science we can deliver from space out into the end users, like people like banks, like people like insurers, like people like homeowners.
And Harshbir, I want to jump to you. We're going to go back to how to optimize that data. But Harshbir, you lead the space capabilities at the UK Space Agency. And just yesterday, the UK launched the first mission of its kind to monitor forest health from space, with a special focus on the Amazon. So can you tell us about that mission and what makes it such a game changer for this climate crisis?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think first and foremost, before I talk about biomass, which was a mission that got launched yesterday, truly exciting day for the space sector, but the world as a whole. Just to say, what a privilege it to be here as part of this panel, along with my ex-boss, who was our Minister for Space and Science, who remains quite an advocate for space. And before I talk about biomass, just to kind of put that into context, so we as a UK Space Agency, we invest 70% of our funding into the European Space Agency, and that's really critical for missions like biomass to actually happen. And when George was the Minister for Space back in 2022, he actually got us the biggest amount of investment we ever made in the European Space Agency, about 2 billion euros. And as part of that, 400 million was invested in Earth observation programs. Again, obviously the biggest investment ever. What the investment enables is, it actually enables the UK to use the opportunity of few million to expand and do a mission within the UK itself, which would have been possible on its own. So why biomass is so critical? It's a UK conceived mission, conceived at the University of Sheffield. It was developed in Stevenage by Airbus UK. So it's a fully UK developed mission, but it was developed with the international partners using the multilateral forum of European Space Agency as a funding lever. What the mission does, it's going to do quite a few things, but large focus is the tropical forest, Amazon being one. Now, we have had missions so far where the radar systems cannot penetrate the canopy of the tropical dense forest. And what this mission does, for the first time ever, it will penetrate down 5 meters down the soil level. So we can have a 3D vision of our tropical forest for the first time ever, which wouldn't have been possible with the existing satellites or the technology that we have. What that enables is, it will help us understand the carbon content that's within the trees itself, i.e. how much carbon is stored in the trees, and how much carbon is being released into the atmosphere once when the deforestation happens. It will help us understand what kind of a climate monitoring and the challenge that we face from a carbon perspective or the carbon dioxide perspective. That's the kind of one element. I guess the other element is it would really help us develop a 3D model of our biodiversity as a whole, which hasn't been possible so far. So the P-band radar, which is unique in itself, developed in the UK, is the first time ever that technology has been unleashed as of yesterday. We are now looking forward to obviously the large umbrella which will act as obviously a bit of a satellite for the Earth, for it to open in the coming days and the data to be disseminated back to Earth. But it's only been possible because we are part of a bigger multilateral fora, that's European Space Agency.
Right. Now I want to jump with George now that you have mentioned him. So of course you are a long-standing advocate for science and innovation, and especially what has to do with the space economy and its use to combat climate change. And in your own words before this panel, you told me that the UK is the Formula One pit lane of space, high performance, agile, and tech forward. So what makes the UK so relevant when it comes to this space versus climate change?
Yeah, well look, three things. Firstly, the space sector domain is, I think you can think of it in a few ways. There's a exploration, really deep exploration. This is the frontier of human life, and it's out there that we're discovering how this planet came to be formed, how the galaxy works, and all of that amazing stuff. Secondly, it's a big defense and security domain. And thirdly, it is a huge technology domain. It's in space that we're testing, defining, shaping so many of the technologies that we need back on Earth. And fourthly, it is from space that we saw the fragile Earth, formed for the first time a consciousness of this fragile planet. And slightly counterintuitively, I want to suggest that it's in space and going to space that we are developing the microdosing, the microenergy, the nutraceuticals, the food, a lot of the technologies, because you have to do everything up there with so little. Those will be the technologies that we'll then need down here for sustainable growth. So I don't think enough people around the world think of space as a natural domain for net zero. I think it's completely fundamental, both from the data point of view, and I've been working with companies like Planet, GHGSat, they can now track methane emissions by factory. In fact, the other day they tracked to a golf course, to a tee, where there was a leak in the plastic on a landfill site and said, your golf course is emitting methane. So this is amazing technology that then drives the market for accountability and carbon border adjustment mechanisms. But it's also the technologies up there in energy, in food, in health. It's the testbed, the ultimate laboratory for sustainable growth.
Now we're going to be talking later about the challenges and about why we haven't gotten there yet, even though the UK has so much potential, which brings me back to Donna and about all this data that we have gathered and that it's unused so far. So what is getting in the way and what is needed to unlock the full value of the data that we're gathering from space?
I think the key thing that's getting in our way is we tend to think in silos. Okay, so it's a very technical field, and Earth observation specialists tend to speak Earth observation specialist language, which then, sexy space is sexy, right? But actually, when you go so far and start talking about the really technical components, you lose people really quickly. And people don't think they understand it well enough to be able to use it. So we need to find a very simple way to communicate the value of the data from space. And that's where we need these new thinking processes around things like the infrastructure we can deliver from the UK, which Harshby is working on, to make sure that companies can utilize this information. And they need to be able to make sure they can utilize it in a way that's trusted as well. So we need to make sure that we've got right standards in place. There's still a lot of work to do around these things. But ultimately, we need to stop getting so hung up about the perfect. The data is there. We have the technologies. We need to start using these things. And it may be off by 20%, but do you know what? That's better than nothing. So we need to really make sure that people can start using these type of capabilities. As George said, the reason why we use Earth observation is because we saw from space how fragile we are. And actually, we need to use these capabilities to really help us make sure we've got a resilient future. So we're working very closely now with companies to see how we can actually make sure we can get these data observation pieces into their systems. So how do we process that in a different way that means they don't have to adopt new platforms, they can use it and just pull the data across? And I think that's one of the key unlocks we need to do. And to make sure those pricing models, I hate to get boring about that, but actually that's one of the barriers as well. We need to make sure that the pricing and the value of the data that's displayed fits those end use cases.
I think for me that's the key, is we need to create a market. Once there's a market, once there's an incentive for companies, governments to be able to account for their emissions properly, you've created a market for all that data. At the moment, the data supply is ahead of the demand. Good, responsible companies are making sure they can track and cover their supply chains, but we've got to move more quickly on mandating and regulating and incentivizing. So if you're compliant, if you know where your emissions are, if you're tracking them, if you're using good Earth observation data, tick, 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 quicker licensing, quicker, better regulation, better market access. We have to create that market as well.
There is one more piece to that, actually, is that a lot of companies don't know where to look. So we still need to be able to enable companies to locate their assets, and that's part of the missing puzzle, if you like.
Harsber, anything that you would like to add? Where are the challenges here, and what would be the exact solution or the strategy that you would use to unlock the full potential?
Yes, I think Donna and George have already covered the kind of main challenges. I think the challenge for me is the confidence in take-up of data, and that can only come from having standards for data, which we're currently working on, having a regulatory framework which will enable the markets to be created where different commercial partners can actually access and use data with confidence. So I think that's probably the key driver for the uptake of data. I guess the other side of the data is also the dissemination and accessibility of it. So one of the things we at the UK Space Agency are working on is creating what I call the midstream. So we all know upstream, the missions are developed, the applications happen, but generally where we are failing and the gap exists is the midstream, which is we don't have all-encompassing and all kind of, I guess in some ways, connected infrastructure for space in the UK. So we are really quite razor-focused on creating a capability so we can bring all the key data sets into one system, and then obviously you have a bit of a one front door to access data, whether you're academia or you're a business. I think that's one thing we need in the UK, and we're not the only ones across the globe. The others who do have access to some of the European infrastructure are also creating the sovereign capability. So we're trying to do exactly the same to enable the data to be utilized in the way that perhaps it isn't at the moment.
Can I just give you an example, a really tangible example? So agriculture is responsible for 25% of global emissions. It's absolutely key if we're going to get to net zero. And in agri-tech, we've now developed amazing technologies. I was with an agronomy company the other day. The tractor cabs today have got telemetry, they've got satellite data. They can map by 6 meter squares in the field where they should be applying chemicals or not. They are able to look across a field at yields versus input, and within the field map where we should be setting aside and where we should be cultivating. Amazing technology. Hopeless policy framework. There is absolutely no incentive for farmers to use that data. So we've got a big mismatch between what technology can do and what the markets in which operators are operating are incentivized to do. And that's partly why I came back to Parliament, because we, as legislators, have got to create this market much more quickly.
And George, picking up on that and what we were discussing before about the UK having so much potential. If the UK has all the tech and talent, why are we not leading in the space spectrum yet? You've said before that the problem is also a political one. Do you still think that's the case?
Yeah, so to be clear, we don't have all the tech. And I think, as with so many areas, the UK, we've got to think globally about where we really have a USP. We're never going to beat, and shouldn't try and beat, Beijing or Washington on having a vertically integrated defense space program. I mean, we're not going to play in that space. We're not actually even at the stage of Canada, Switzerland, Japan, Australia in having strong big space agencies and big space programs. And I call us a Formula One pit lane without a car, because we've got incredible strengths in Earth observation, in telemetry, in spectrum, in smart antennae, in all the clever engineering bits, which everyone will need. But I think our really big USP is regulation. We're in a wild west in space. Beijing and Washington aren't going to legislate. There's 1 million pieces of debris, 40 tons of debris, redundant satellites. It's chaos up there. It's becoming a big cost risk, which is why as Minister I stepped in and said, well, hang on, someone has got to set in place some basic debris regulation. And we've set up the Earth Space Sustainability Initiative here in London. And we're setting out a kite mark so that compliant companies who are reducing their debris, i.e. they're recyclable, they're in-flight serviceable, Astroscale, Oxford company can retrieve your satellite for you. If you're compliant, then we'll give you quicker, better insurance, quicker licensing and access to ESG finance. That's a role for the UK. We're a regulator around the world. And I think that's how we can connect to this sector and connect ESG finance properly so that we create a market for sustainable investment. Because it's not going to happen out of Beijing, and certainly not under this president in Washington. The world needs some rules in space, and it needs some market for sustainability. I think that's a good opportunity for us.
All right. Donna, I just want to continue with this. So how much of this problem is, or comes down to communication? You know, not being part of the storytelling or not telling the story in the proper way?
I think a huge part of it's down to storytelling. It's quite interesting, isn't it, how, you know, all of this rhetoric that's coming out from the States, for example, around climate is casing it around religion, but this is real fact. And actually the key thing about Earth observation is that actually we can tell you those facts because we can observe them and we can be transparent and we can be objective. And I think that the key problem that we've had with the whole Earth observation space is because it is complex. You know, we tend to mask it and we get really excited about tech and we start talking tech. And I come from the geospatial industry as well. We're just as bad in that one. We're acronym heavy, etc. So it makes it really inaccessible for most people to think about how they can benefit from using these specialist data sets, if you like. But actually what we're beginning to see now is a shift. So we were talking earlier about the new Law Society warning card that's coming out around conveyancing. They've got to report on climate, you know, climate risks and things like that. So how are they going to do that if they don't have the information in their hands? And so it's these shifts that we're going to see around the needs and the way that they need to communicate this to end users that actually is going to start the adoption much more rapidly than we've ever seen before. So we need to make sure our companies that are under the umbrella of things like Space for Climate can actually deliver these services.
And then the next question to Harshbir and George, perhaps Harshbir can answer this one first. So there's a growing perception of space as luxury, right? Just a few weeks ago, we saw Jeff Bezos' billionaire rocket launch that stirred up all sorts of public criticism. So how do we change the narrative so people don't look at it as a playground for the rich, but something that can really help life on Earth?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think so space obviously has got a bit of a challenge with the image of space, because whatever makes the news is either the launch or obviously the stuff obviously that Blue Origin or SpaceX do in terms of astronauts traveling into space. But I guess obviously what we are trying to do as an agency and working cross government is try and champion space, the use of space, and trying to obviously showcase how the benefits of space can be brought back to Earth. So one of the things I always often say that our modern day life on Earth depends on space, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's mobility, the way obviously we travel, whether it's financial transaction. More often people don't realize that every time you're taking the money out, or obviously financial transaction, there's a timing element which space enables for you to be able to access the money when you most need it. And then obviously there's a broader obviously impact of space, which is the Earth observation part, the climate monitoring, and so forth. But I guess obviously if you are talking about the communications and the step change we need to be able to get people to understand the value of space, we need to decouple space being obviously quite exciting and very sexy to obviously what is the real impact of space on Earth. And that's what we're trying to do, because more often than not, everyone talks about space is obviously very exciting. I can tell you, if you come and work in the UK Space Agency, it's equally as boring as any other organization. It's not as exciting or sexy, but the work we do, it's quite impactful in the way that obviously most other organizations perhaps don't, because space do provide a unique vantage point for us that you can't have obviously any other measure which can enable being able to see our beautiful planet from one part, which is far away, thousands of kilometers away from here. So it's actually how do you shift the narrative in the communications is what's needed. And that's not just the role of the agency. I think that actually applies to every one of us who is using the space technology on a daily basis.
George, I want to hear your opinion about this.
Yeah, look, I think if you talk to people around the country about space, they typically think of the very powerful visual image. They think of Elon Musk. They think of the big rocket launch. They see the plumes of rocket fuel. They assume it must be environmentally unsustainable, and it must be a playground for big military, big state, big tech, big money. And whilst some of that is true, I think the story we have to tell, which is the truth, is it's from space that we understood for the first time the fragility of this planet. It's from space that we're understanding life and the systems of life, and why it is that the interplanetary structure is repeated in the very atomic structure of every cell. I'll just hold that thought for a minute. In the Big Bang, something happened to create life, and I don't want to go all Carl Sagan on you, but when he says from the DNA in our bones to the calcium in our teeth, we are but reassembled stardust. It is up in space that we are working out how this planet was formed and the base systems that operate it. And in health, I'm doing some work on quantum biology and the role of quantum systems in mitochondrial base operating software at cellular level. So I think we should excite people that space is the ultimate frontier. Secondly, it's the kind of new Antarctic. It's the place that we can decide whether how we behave in it, how we use it, and how in going to it, we look after it and learn about ourselves through it. And it's the test bed where we're developing the technologies that we're going to need for planetary sustainability. This planet, we've got to do a lot more with a lot less. In agriculture, we've got to double food production on the same land area with half as much water and energy in 25 years, or have mass famines, mass migrations, and chaos. Well, I'm very confident we could do it. We've got the technology to do it. It's in space that we're working out how to do a lot of this, because you have to do everything with tiny quantities. And so I think there's a story to tell that this is the great frontier of planetary and human science, and we all need to take an interest in it and support it for our own good.
So I am going to allow some questions from the audience. So while I let you think about some, I'll ask my next question here. So based on what you were saying, George, do you all think then space could be the answer to the race to net zero? I mean, could we get there faster thanks to space?
It's part of the answer. It needs us to take action. So it gives us the insights, but we need to act on those. And I think that's the gap. We need to get the information in the way to enable those actions to happen. And George is right. The planet doesn't care if we don't do anything. It will do its thing. She's been doing this for millions of years. She doesn't care, etc. So it's down to us as a human race to decide if we want to live on this planet or not in the way that we want to live. So we have to use the space assets, the data, to give us those insights, but we have to act on those insights. There's no point of us saying like, "Ooh, we've got deforestation over here." Hello, if nobody works on it, if nobody makes that change, because we can do that now. We can tell people what's going on the planet now. We've been able to do that for a number of years. It's the action that's missing.
Just very quickly from me, if you're going to put the data into perspective, so we have got 55 essential climate variables that we need to monitor the health of our planet. 2/3 of them can only be monitored from space, as you said earlier. But the thing is, it's not about just about monitoring. I'll give you an example. I was in India a couple of weeks ago attending the Disaster Charter meeting, which we are part of. And it was only when I was there I understood the impact the space data is having, which is a collective space data, not just from the Indian Space Research Organization, but pooled together by the UK Space Agency and others. 400 million people in India are at a constant risk of flooding. And just put that into perspective, that's nearly 5 times and over 5 times the population of the UK, constant risk of flooding. India is able to use the space data to save millions of lives on a yearly basis, because they can forward monitor where the potential floods are going to be and the impact of those floods on the communities. So the impact of space is different for different communities across the globe. We just need to make sure, obviously, the space data is there when we actually most need it. And whether it's 10% of the data that's being used or the 90% of it, it's actually what's the impact of data that really matters to human beings here on Earth.
Maybe a question from the audience before we ran out of time. There's one over there. Do we have a microphone?
Hi, I'm Sarah from Canopy, and I have two questions. The first is about space debris. George, you hinted at a company that's recycling space debris. I was wondering if you could show or share any more interesting case studies of, I suppose, recycled debris being used and how it's being used. And I've lost my train of thought now, but that was the main question. I just wanted to know about insights into the reuse of space debris. Okay, the second question was about Harshbir, you mentioned about Earth observation, looking at the canopy, and I was wondering if that's just happening in the Amazon, or if that's something that is available for other rainforests, and if it's just the top layer of the canopy, or if it's the 3 layers going down into the soil. Thank you.
Very quickly,
Yeah,
George.
great question. So look, I'll happily have a chat afterwards as well, but if you have a look at the Earth Space Sustainability Initiative, ESSI, that was the project that we set up here in the UK, and I was very strongly of the view that we can't just wait for the rest of the world. Somebody has to take a lead, and His Majesty the King backed that initiative very strongly and has set up Astra Carta and sent a very strong global message of sustainability at the heart of our space missions and regulation. If you have a look at the SE website, we're now developing a series of standards, kite marks, with the British Standards BSI, and international space agencies and companies are affiliating. Basically, it's sort of ISO compliance. And then what we need to do is match those standards to incentives in the market. And on debris, it's a huge sector. Astroscale in Oxfordshire is the company that, it's a bit James Bond, but they are basically the AA of space. They will go and find your satellite, pick it, take it in, recharge the batteries, clean it, re-software it, give it another lease of life. And when your satellite has died, they will go and pick it up and bring it back. And that creates a whole secondary market of recycling. So there's a whole raft of companies. This is a good example where regulation creates industries, creates markets. We hear a lot about deregulation. I really believe in the power of good agile regulation to create sustainable markets. And that's a good example, I think.
And just kind of adding to it before I respond to the canopy question, we talk about obviously the UK space economy being innovative. I think in-orbit service and manufacturing, where companies like Astroscale come into play, that's where UK is quite unique. That's a USP. We are a step ahead of the rest of the world in understanding obviously what actually could be our role in the space sector as a whole. So UK obviously is, I guess obviously, if I say a step ahead, it's actually heading into the direction where there's a vacuum and an opportunity. And in-orbit servicing and manufacturing is a really good opportunity. In terms of the canopy, a two-part question. So yes, it will go down all the way to the soil level, but equally obviously it can go below the soil level by 5 meters, so it can actually give us a 3D visualization of the tropical rainforest as such. Now we've got about 5 trillion trees across the whole globe. So over the 18 months, that's the first challenge for the mission itself. It will try and create a 3D map for literally the whole of the biomass across the globe. So that's where the biomass mission, and that's why it's so critical and quite unique in its form.
Okay, 1 minute and a half, last question. So 1 sentence per person. What would it take to make the UK a global hub where space, climate, trade, and innovation all come together and actually deliver impact? What's the one opportunity we cannot miss?
I'll give you, I think setting Earth space sustainability standards and showing how you connect them to incentives in the market, in insurance, in regulation, and in ESG finance. I think that will do more than anything to make this country the hub of a sustainable space economy.
Harshbir?
I guess obviously, what's happening transatlantic, they'll create a bit of a vacuum, and I think we should be ready as the UK to cover some of the vacuum when that actually emerges. But I think for me, it's always about international collaboration, but convergence of policies, because far too often we can keep on doing our own stuff in silos. That's not where the space sector is. That's not how it operates. So I think if we can converge on the policies as a whole, we've got real opportunity to play quite a critical part as the UK.
I agree with George. I think regulation is really key. I think standards are really key. But also we need scale-up funding in the UK as well to really support these companies. They're nearly there, but they just need to get that a little bit further forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Please let's give a warm round of applause here